Late Night with Frances. Yeah.
Good evening. Thanks for tuning into Late Night with Frances Conable. I'm your host, Frances Conable. I have with me tonight women's rights activist Margaret Sanger. She is arguably one of the most influential figures in the fight for birth control, and her legacy has had a lasting effect on women's reproductive rights today. Thanks for being here, Margaret.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to tell my story.
Your story with birth control began in 1916 when you opened America's first birth control clinic, correct?
Yes, before 1916, I was working as a nurse, so every day I encountered women that were experiencing unwanted pregnancies. In the poorer neighborhoods of New York, most families could not support any more children. But as wives, it was their duty to have sex with their husbands, so at that time, the only real form of birth control was abstinence, which was impossible. So these people resorted to cheap abortions that often ended in injury or death.
That's terrible.
I agree. After seeing women in this situation for a few years, I decided to do something about it, and I started a birth control clinic in Brooklyn.
Wasn't it illegal at the time to even discuss birth control?
Yes, in both federal and state laws, the Comstock Act was a federal law prohibiting the distribution of articles of immoral use, and that was passed in 1873. Its main purpose was criminalizing contraceptives and abortions. Also, New York state law said that only doctors could provide birth control information, and even then, in only possibly fatal circumstances.
But you were willing to break the law for your cause?
Of course. In this instance, the law was wrong. It would have made my job much easier if the law had been on my side, however. I was sent to jail a total of 8 times. This was very hard on my husband and 3 children, and it also put my work with the birth control clinic on pause.
What was the public's reaction to you opening up your clinic?
It was overwhelmingly positive. Within the first few days of opening, before I was arrested, hundreds of desperate women showed up. I wish I had had more information to provide them with. At the time, the concept of birth control was rudimentary at best, but I told these women everything I could.
I really admire your perseverance. Now I know that opening the clinic was only the beginning of your advocacy for women's rights. What was your next step?
Well, in 1921, I started the American Birth Control League. Our mission was to bring acceptance of birth control to America, so it would become more accessible. The league eventually became Planned Parenthood, which is a pretty widely known organization.
I would sure say so. Can you tell us about how birth control options have changed through the years?
Yes. So when I first coined the term birth control in 1914, the main form was abstinence and illegal abortions, although I was a big promoter of the diaphragm.
What's a diaphragm?
It's a partition that blocks the woman's cervix during sex. Due to a relatively low success rate, it is no longer a very popular form of birth control. However, it was the best option at the time. This lack of options was what made me want to invent the pill.
Wow, you really took matters into your own hands. How did that come about?
Well, I wanted an oral contraceptive that women could take daily to be available, and nothing like this was on the market. So I partnered with Dr. Gregory Pincus to create my vision. Our research was sponsored by Miss Catherine McCormick, and in 1960 we came up with a pill known as Enovid. It was the first birth control of its time.
And how old were you at the time of Enovid's invention?
I was 81.
So you devoted your whole life to the crusade for birth control, a crusade that you ultimately started. It really is no wonder that you're known as the largest historical contributor to the cause for birth control.
Thank you, Frances. I was just doing what I saw as my part in making women's lives better. My mother died when I was 19 of tuberculosis, weakened by 17 pregnancies, 7 of which were miscarriages. I feel her death could have been avoided if she hadn't been weakened by those numerous unwanted pregnancies. I feel it is incredibly important that my daughters and granddaughters have the power to control their bodies and their health without having to give up sex, which is a natural part of life.
Very true. Now I would like to take a moment to talk to you about birth control rights in America today, if that's all right. It's been almost 100 years since you became involved with the birth control movement, and a lot has changed. The use of contraceptives is now legal for everyone, and many forms of birth control are widely available. 62% of women of reproductive age are currently using birth control, and 99% of women aged 15 to 45 who have had sex have used contraceptives at least once. We have come a long way in accepting birth control, but it is still an issue of some debate. Many major religions condemn the use of birth control, and it remains a taboo topic that is not often discussed. Also, the high cost of some forms of long-term birth control make use an economic impossibility for many women. What are your responses to these current issues?
Well, first off, I'd like to say how incredibly proud I am of all the major advances this country has made in terms of birth control. The situation can still be improved, however. Birth control needs to be more widely talked about in all sectors of life so that we can get rid of the social stigma surrounding it. There's no reason that talking about ways to prevent unwanted pregnancy should be in any way taboo. I think a wider public acceptance will lead to an end to religious stigma as well. Also, more forms of birth control should be covered on basic health care plans so that contraceptives can be attainable to more women.
Those all seem like very constructive ways to move forward in the future. We are nearing the end of our time tonight, but before we go, I would like to finish with a quote from Margaret Sanger's autobiography, My Fight for Birth Control, that I feel highlights the need for accessible birth control both at the time it was written and today. I could now see clearly the various social strata of our life. All its mass problems seem to be centered around uncontrolled breeding. There was only one thing to be done: call out, start the alarm, set the heather on fire, awaken the womanhood of America to free the motherhood of the world. With that, I would like to thank Margaret Sanger for coming, and I would like to thank you, our viewers, for watching. Good night.